Hello, my name is Christof Bernau at the UC Santa Cruz Center for Agroecology, and today we're going to talk about the value of vacuum seeders in a small-scale greenhouse operation to increase some of your efficiency and ultimately some of your crop quality by the uniformity and consistency of your sowings. First of all, I just want to say that in our experience here, we have found that sowing by hand versus using a vacuum seeder, the one that we have here, for some seeds, round seeds like things in the brassica family, collards, kale, broccoli, and so forth, round seeds like that and things like pelleted lettuce seeds, those sorts of seeds can typically be sown at roughly 5 times the rate that it takes the time that it takes to sow them by hand. So there's a really substantial time and labor savings involved in using a vacuum seeder. For other seeds, maybe more irregularly shaped and oblong seeds like cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers, because they don't move around quite as fluidly on the seed plate, which I'll show you in a moment, the process is definitely not 5 times as fast, but can probably be, in most instances we found, it's roughly double the speed of trying to sow them by hand. So still a substantial improvement, but depending upon the volume of crops that you're sowing and the species of crops that you're sowing, you might find that investing in a vacuum seeder for your operation could be an incredible investment and a very, very fast return on that investment, or it may be something that only gives you moderate benefit, depending on the crops that you're growing. Just to give you a little bit of sense of cost and scale, I have friends and folks who work with homemade DIY seeders where they've basically purchased a small shop vacuum, built a wooden frame, drilled holes that correspond to their sowing trays into that plate, and then lined everything up, and the whole system is literally only about $50 worth of materials. Pretty inexpensive, and maybe even being able to salvage some stuff you have on site. Kind of in the middle-ish end of the spectrum, for example, Johnny's Selected Seeds sells a small vacuum seeder, handheld vacuum seeder. The unit itself costs about $700, I believe, and then the individual seed plates range from about $150 up to like $300 each. So substantially more money, but still something incredibly useful. One thing to know though about that system, at least at this point in time, I believe it only is available for seed plates that are available for the 1020 style trays, the sort of narrow rectangular trays that are often that sort of lightweight plastic style. But if that's the system you use, that could be a very, very worthy investment. And then on the little bit more on the upper end of the spectrum that is still going to be well suited to a small scale farm would be something like this seeder here, that the unit itself is about $2,700, and then similarly each individual seed plate is in the $150 to $300 range, this being the seed plate here. And in each instance, you're going to want to really think about the seeds that you're commonly sowing, and especially sowing in volume where increase in efficiency is going to be really helpful for you. And then you're going to want to purchase a seed plate or drill your own seed plate accordingly with holes that are appropriate to the size seed that you're working with. We've got a range of seed plates for our operation here. We have 5 different seed plates, though for the crops that we grow, this particular seed plate is the most common one because it works really well for pelleted lettuce, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, and kale. For some of the brassicas, there's some variation in the seed size, and sometimes we switch to another plate for them, but this is our most common plate. The system is pretty straightforward, and I'm going to walk through this before I turn it on so you kind of know what all the steps are. We've already filled our trays. We've pre-dibbled them so that the seeds will land in the right place. You'll notice in this system, There's two guide rails here that keep the tray centered directly under the seed plate. And then we've got these two marks here that are going to tell me exactly where my tray should line up. So I'll slide my tray in, look on one side, look on the other, make sure I'm just right centered. Now my tray is in position for sowing. I'm going to have a second tray ready to go. In this case, I'm going to sow 2 trays of broccoli to start this process. So I have my second tray ready to go so that as soon as I'm done with the first, I can slide right into the second. So now I'm primed and set up. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of my seed and I'm going to dump a whole bunch of seed on this seed plate. You actually want to have an excess of seed because then that makes it a lot easier when the seed is rolling back and forth, because we're going to move with the vacuum on, we'll move this back and forth, and that's going to help move the seed around on the seed plate, and then the vacuum pressure is what's going to actually pull and hold seeds in these individual holes that are lined up to land right in the center of each of my cells on my tray. So another important thing to know about here, I can sow multiple trays with this without refilling this, because right here you can kind of see under where my paintbrush is, there's basically a reservoir where I've got surplus seed. So you'll see when I turn on the vacuum, I'm going to go back and forth. All those seeds are moving all over the place. And then once I've got a seed on every cell, I'm going to tip it up, tap it so that the extras all fall down into this reservoir, and then I'll turn the whole tray over, turn this whole seed plate over, drop the seed, and then slide that tray out, bring the next one in, and continue the process. I will say one person can do all of this very effectively on their own, but it can be really beneficial to have a second person. One person who's principally working on the seed plate and dropping seed, and then a second person who is feeding trays to the station here, and then pulling the trays off, covering them, and taking them to the greenhouse. But that can all certainly be done with one person. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'll try to point out, again, all the processes in kind of real time, live here. Before we get too much further into this, and before I turn the vacuum on, I just want to make one sort of safety reminder, self-preservation reminder. The vacuum is fairly loud, and if you're going to be sowing multiple trays of seed and doing this for any length of time, I would highly encourage you to protect your ears with earphones or phone earplugs or something that's going to give you a little bit of buffer from that sound. So now that we're ready to go, I've got my seed in the tray already dumped. I'm going to flip my vacuum on, and then basically with that excess of seed, I'm just going to go back and forth. A lot of times it's a little harder to get seed out on the outside edges, I've found. So I'll sweep some extra seed there. I'm going to go back and forth until I've got seed everywhere. Little gentle tap with the hammer. And then I'm going to give it a close look before I commit to seeding. Oh, I see one that doesn't have a seed, so I'll just try to get a seed right there. There we go. I'm going to make sure that I don't have multiple seeds in this bottommost one. Sometimes when you have a lot of seed in the tray, you'll get a surplus building up on this bottom and then multiple seeds sown in the bottom row, and which is actually corresponds to this row here. So that's something to be on the lookout for. I tip this over, I break the vacuum seal, give it a little tap to release the seeds. Tray's empty. If we look really closely here, you'll see there's a seed in the center of my dibble in every single cell. I'm just going to slide this out of my way. Bring my next tray in. Line it up. One thing that can happen, I've got a little bit of debris that is accumulated in the hole, so I'm not getting good grip on a couple of these cells. So periodically it can be really valuable to do a little bit of maintenance. Clean out your tray, just don't assume that your holes are clean, because this is slowing me down and not what I'm hoping for. But yeah, so I would take the whole seed tray off, run a vacuum over it, or take like either a paper clip or a little wire and ream out each of those holes. And then I'll be good to go. There we go. And that's it for those two trays, which obviously were a little bit slower because we're on camera, but that's the basic idea. Once I've got my trays full, I'm going to take some surplus soil, and then I'm either gonna kind of sprinkle back and forth like this, or some people like to use what we call the smear technique, where you just take a handful of soil and kind of smear or swipe it across the whole top. That can work really well, especially if your seeds really genuinely landed in the bottom of your dibbles, because then they will not get dislodged as you're wiping your hand across the top. Let's cover that tray. Come back and cover this tray. I can kind of use the sprinkle technique where I'll still do a tiny bit. When I do this, I'm really just barely brushing my hand across the surface. If I see any clumps like that, I'm going to break them up. Got my label, and I'm ready to carry these off and into the greenhouse. So pretty fast, pretty straightforward. One thing I should point out is if you want to change seed and go to a different variety, then you could try to scoop all these seeds out. But what we typically like to do is just take the seed plate off, which is it's just in there with a couple little, essentially a nut and bolt combo. I'm going to lift this out, and then in this case I might dump these into like a small bucket that then I could dump back into the seed pack. But in this case, because I have a relatively large seed pack, I can simply carefully tilt and return my surplus seed to the tray, or to the packet. So then I'll put this one back on so that we can do the next, move on to the next variety. A couple things I just want to say in terms of just process. As I said, really think about return on investment. Maybe you want to start with a DIY model, build one yourself, or a friend who's got appropriate skills and so forth. Build one and see if that works for you. And then if it does really work for you and you feel like, oh, this is good, but I could be even more efficient, then maybe you want to invest in a more expensive off-the-shelf model. This is especially useful if you're sowing pelleted seeds and round seeds, but is still useful with really pretty much any type of seed. The key thing is matching the seed plate, the hole size in the seed plate to the size of the seed that you're working with, and then also making sure that that seed plate corresponds perfectly to your trays. So one area where this is probably not going to work for you is if you're using all sorts of different cell sizes and container shapes and so forth, then you're going to have a real narrow window of who you might be able to use your vacuum seeder for. But if you have uniform tray shape configuration, in this case the 1326, or else all 1020s, one or the other, and you have consistent cell size, like this is a 242 cell, and we do the vast majority of our crops in the 242 cells. So we've got all of our seed plates drilled to this 242 configuration, and that gives us great versatility and really builds the efficiency into the process. So this may not be for everyone, may not be appropriate in all circumstances, but I definitely encourage you to think, is this the type of system that could build efficiency into my process, build quality into my process, and ultimately translate to better crops down the road? In our instance, we also have a number of other seed plates that can be useful for us. And I just want to hold them up here so you get a sense of the variation in hole size. This is seed plate K for raw lettuce seed that's really quite lightweight. Pelleted snapdragons, still very small. Poppies, amaranth, a few things like that. You can barely see the seed holes. They're so small. But this is designed for certain seeds. Moving up the scale, sometimes larger kale seed, basil, broccoli. This can be the appropriate plate because not all kale, not all broccoli seed, even though they're all brassicas, not all varieties, the seed is necessarily the exact same size. So you may have a subtle difference and subtle improvement in efficacy with that plate instead. Moving up the spectrum here, this one, a little bit larger holes. This one we use for tomatoes in particular and for stock seed, really useful in that regard. And then there are larger size holes possible. This is the largest one that we have, though. Works really well for chard, for larger pelleted lettuce seed. And you can see these holes are exponentially bigger than the tray that I showed you that was for things like the amaranth and the raw lettuce seed. So this is an investment. Each of these are $200 to $300 each. You really want to try to get a good sense of where is that investment going to be most useful. And maybe you only buy a couple trays right from a couple of seed plates right from the outset, and then after you've decided, oh, this really works well for me, now I'm going to invest in more trays that accommodate a wider range of the seeds that I work with. But if you are really concerned about your budget, start with what's going to be most useful in terms of time savings and the crops that you sow most frequently, and then from there decide how you might want to expand out.